Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if North Korea won the Korean War. North Korea is nowadays considered a totalitarian dictatorship. North Korea is, as the name says, the northern part of Korea. But it claims all of Korea and also the territories that are contested by both Koreas. North Korea was created as Soviet occupation zone, and Kim Il-sung slowly but surely gained power through a committee and later on by eliminating most of his opponents. His rule became so tight that he became a dictator. North Korea was an ally to the Soviets, but later on became more allied with China and even a country like Romania, for instance. The cult of personality of Kim Il-sung inspired Ceausescu to do the same in his country of Romania, for instance. The Juche ideology was founded as an own Korean inspiration and interpretation of communism, and later on the Army First principle was introduced by the son of Kim Il-sung, called Kim Jong-Il. Under Kim Jong-Il, North Korea became increasingly isolationist and relied heavily on China, but also on international aid that they would get by doing some pressures, like for instance having atomic bomb tests. With the death of Kim Jong-il, his son Kim Jong-Un tried to make some reforms and tried to give the appearance of changes and a possible opening of his country. Kim Jong-un even met with Donald Trump and was relatively open to negotiate certain things. But it seemed that the nuclear weapons would remain an important matter to North Korea, and they were not open to destroy their nuclear weapon arsenal. But why is that? Well, having almost no allies, the only way for North Korea to survive is through the possession of nuclear weapons. Their economy was relatively good until the 70s, but, well, it was overshadowed within some more years by their southern neighbors. And also coupling the fact that they actually got the economically more valuable parts of the Koreas. The Korean War is nowadays seen as an aggression from North Korea and especially Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung's goal was to unite all of Korea, because technically Korea was for almost 30 or 40 years under occupation from a foreign power, that being the Empire of Japan. Moreover, the South was seen as relatively weak, economically unstable, and too distant from any important ally like the US, for instance. North Korea hoped to get Soviet and Chinese support, and at the end only the Chinese managed to somehow keep North Korea alive, even until today. But what if all of that changed? What if North Korea won the Korean War? North Korea was close to annex almost all of the Korean peninsula and win the war within a short amount of time. One could say that in a possible alternate timeline, North Korea would actually win the war and the UN forces would somehow not be able to organize themselves, be it because the North Koreans were too fast or because there was just too much disorganization between the allies. The US let the Berlin airlift and also the fall of China happen. With more pessimism or just failing to see why they should just hold on to South Korea, North Korea would have the best chances to get away with it and win the Korean War, which could be labeled as the Unification War. Well, it would have some positive effects. First of all, more people will be alive. Second of all, more industries, they will still exist as well. And third of all, there will be far less damage, because the front lines, they moved in our timeline, while if the North Koreans, they will just be able to sweep in and just take everything, you will have no front line that is moving around. And the fourth point is that the North Korean regime will be seen in a more positive light by the local population. North Korea or the People's Republic of Korea would have achieved their primary goal, and this without foreign help, nor from the Soviets or the Chinese, which is very important for the psyche of Korea. The People's Republic of Korea would not be in debt of any other country and thus be seen as truly independent. Stalin in his last years would not have any reaction to that, and since we are discussing a Korean-centered scenario, well, we will assume that the Soviets will just continue to do the same policies as in OTL. China would not see Korea as their puppet, and their army would have less experience in OTL, because they would have no fighting experience in an actual war. An invasion of Taiwan would be thus more unlikely than even in our timeline, because the US would, instead of invading back Korea, arm Taiwan much more, as well as Japan, and probably also keep a very tight eye on the Philippines as well. The same would go for South Vietnam. Anti-communism in the US would be even more in the rise, and McCarthy might have more success in this alternate timeline. It is very likely that the political climate in the US would change, and we would not see any kind of period of approachment for some time. With Khrushchev in power, he would not necessarily be that aggressive with the US, for instance, but show more determined reactions, because there will be no reapproachments between the two. Although we might see some more proxy wars, I don't believe that we could get a nuclear war or the Cold War turning hot suddenly. Cuba might never fall to Castro actually, or the US would actually make a full-scale invasion, and perhaps the Vietnam War could also be won, but yeah, under more extreme conditions. The US would probably, because they were too afraid of communism in this timeline, throw more manpower in there, and more soldiers, they would die, and the economy would also suffer because of that. Anti-war opposition would still exist in the US, but in general the US would be even more conservative than in our timeline. And McCarthy, well, he might actually be seen as a very good political figure, and even someone of importance, or at least a noteworthy politician. What about Korea? Well, Korea would have a key role in the Sino-Soviet split. Korea would try to pull off something similar as Yugoslavia, let's say, but between the communist powers, and not between the East and the West. There are some chances that the relations between the Soviets and the Chinese could even perhaps be normal, especially after Mao's death. Korea as mediator between the two powers would help, but also an extremely anti-communist US would keep the USSR and China somewhat together. Korea would follow less extreme policies, but because it would not need to compensate for anything, because the unification already happened, so there are other primary targets which need to be fulfilled. And because the primary goal of unification would be reached, they would be relatively independent, have even stronger allies, and would not be seen as a puppet state, or this annoying little state that just barks, oh, let's give it some food, let's give some grains, and it will be fine. No, it will be seen in a very different spots. When looking in OTL, we saw that China and Vietnam, despite being anti-capitalist, they opened up their economy, had economic growth as well, and didn't suffer from the fall of the USSR. Korea could pull off something similar. With a higher population, less devastation due to the absence of a war, and a bigger economy, Korea would surely not be a poor country, and they would build more factories wherever they could. Agriculture would also grow by a lot, and without the permanent threat on their border, well, the army could be much smaller and easier to equip with. North Korea and OTL spent almost half of their budget in the army, for instance, or even more. We could see the development of more cities, but in the Soviet Chinese communist style, and consumerism would also be supported by Kim Il-sung's administration. decades earlier than in OTL with Kim Jong-Un's administration. This would also leave some more money to just buy nuclear bombs from the Soviet Union, for instance, or maybe even China, which Korea would still try to get. Korea might become less extreme over time, but hostile towards the West nonetheless. Japan in particular would see this united Korea as a threat and get with Taiwan and the Philippines a huge support from the US. Japan might even remilitarize, just like Western Germany did, but being divided by the sea makes Japan a less dangerous threat than having big bases from a superpower on the border. Korea would surely not get a paradise type of situation, and well, they would still not be that great of a place to live in this alternate timeline, but I could see it somewhere between Eastern Germany and Czechoslovakia in terms of quality of life. Also, North Korea would not rely on the USSR, and with the collapse of the USSR, Korea would turn a leaf and try to appease the US most likely, and even Japan if there was any interest to do so, by opening up their economy, in a similar way as Vietnam did, for instance. Korea would lose many partners, but due to their more stable economic situation, they could find new partners, who would even be willing to trade with them, as Korea would not be seen as this rogue state like in OTR. I would even go so far and say that there would be no Kim dynasty ruling in Korea, and it could be as open as China or Vietnam in OTR. Politically, this Korea would also play an important role and mediate at least between the USSR and Russia, and much later on between China and the US. To sum it up, a Korea united by the North would become less extremist, have more economic opportunities, spend their budget in a more equitable way because that's how they would need to do it, but be less developed than OTL South Korea and be more restricted than OTL Korea. The US would have a longer period of McCarthyism, and McCarthy might possibly be seen as a positive figure, while Asia's geopolitical situation would be different, with a militarized Japan, a more heavily supported Taiwan, and possibly a Western capitalistic Vietnam. And that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.